Hello friends. On 29th August 2023, we marked the anniversary of the commissioning of the first INS Mysore, which was commissioned into the Indian Navy on 29th August 1957. She became the flagship of the Indian Navy, taking over from the first INS Delhi, whose commissioning anniversary we celebrated in July. The erstwhile Delhi and Mysore were our first big ships and pioneered India's blue water journey. They heralded the era of the big ships and laid the foundation for a growing navy. Today, the newer incarnations of these ships lord over the seas. The first avatars, though, have iconic status in the Navy. In this episode, Swaroop, Anand, and Commodore Srikant Kesnur talk about these legendary ships of the Indian Navy and what they meant for the Indian Navy and the nation.
Welcome to Maritime Conversation. I'm Swaroop Anand. I'm here with Commodore Srikant Kesnur. Welcome, Commodore.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Yes, sir. 75 years back, on 5th July 1948, INS Delhi, then called HMIS Delhi, was commissioned. And that was the flagship of the Indian Navy and one of our biggest acquisitions. So we're going to talk about INS Delhi and the INS Mysore, its sister ship. Let's talk about the sisters, Commodore.
Absolutely. As a history maven, these are big favorites for me.
Definitely. We've also had a very riveting article on that.
Yes.
So let's talk about the commissioning of the INS Delhi, and then of course later INS Mysore, but about what they meant to the fledgling navy at that point in time.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's start with that.
Yes, they meant many things,
Right.
and we'll talk about them, through this conversation. But I guess one of the biggest things they meant was a huge change in your thinking. They reflected Indian Navy's ambition, as you say,
Right.
from moving from a fledgling navy. After World War II and at dawn of independence, we had very small ships.
Right.
The sloops,
Yep.
about 1,000 tons,
Right.
were our biggest ships.
Right.
From there, going to a ship of 8 or 9,000 tons, the Delhi and the Mysore, heavier than that,
Right.
was huge.
Right.
In fact, Delhi at full load was, I think, 10,000 tons. So you're going, scaling up humongously.
Right. Right.
And you're buying big ships, acquiring big ships.
Right.
It meant a change in mind, perspective. It meant the beginning of your blue water ambitions.
Right.
Mind you, our plans paper of 25th August 1947,
Right.
just 10 days after independence, mentioned about aircraft carriers and
That's
cruisers.
Right.
So the template was there. And getting Delhi and Mysore, both World War II veterans, so to say,
Right.
big ships meant a lot of things. Cruisers changed the way in which you operated in the fleet. They changed the paradigm. They changed your thinking.
Right.
They did lots of things. They had huge legs. They could go all over the world.
Right.
So there was an operational, concept shift. There was a history in the making.
Yep.
There was defense, diplomacy, and international cooperation.
Right.
There was training. So all these things, and
Right.
virtually they were the sort of nursery of Indian leadership.
Right.
Everyone went through that,
Yeah.
and they had great romance associated about them. So there's one can keep talking. We can actually have many episodes
All of these are
many
again podcasts
maritime
in
conversations.
themselves, right.
Each of them is a podcast in itself. But essentially, they were the flag bearers of an independent Indian Navy. They signaled the growth of India and Indian Navy, and in turn they also trained the Indian Navy to take on bigger and more responsibilities.
Right. Right. So when the Delhi was commissioned, it was commissioned in the UK, where
Yes.
she was, the HMS Achilles, not an ordinary ship. The HMS Achilles. Of course, INS Mysore was earlier HMS Nigeria. So let's talk about those their previous avatars, because again, not ordinary ships.
Not ordinary ships.
Right.
In fact, one of the good things that happened, like I said the other day, that one of the salutary aspects. Of course, colonialism was what it was. But the fact that the Indian Navy's early officers and men had trained in the most preeminent navy of that time and had seen the war, gave us certain advantages and experiences when we built our own navy. And that was reflected in some way in some of the ships that we acquired and various sort of understanding of let's say technological, human, language, training issues that we had with the British. So specifically to Achilles, which became the Delhi, and Nigeria, which became the Mysore, I think both of them were World War II veterans. They had great stories. The Achilles was involved in the first victorious naval action that the Allies had in the Battle of River Plate. One of the most famous battles in which the German pocket battleship Graf Spee was forced to scuttle. We all know about the story. The interesting thing that many people don't know about Swaroop is that the commanding officer of the Achilles at that time, William Edward Perry, he later came to India as the CNC of the Royal Indian Navy,
and was there at Bombay to welcome
the ship. So the commanding officer of Delhi was now the CNC Royal Indian Navy. I mean, as Achilles, he was a CO, and when she became Delhi, he was there to receive her. So I think that was a wonderful sort of coincidence, which talked of the handover and the change of baton. Similarly, Mysore, I have pointed out in my article, probably one of those rare instances of a ship that fired in anger on India, as Nigeria, she fired on Indian soil, Port Blair and Nicobar, in World War II when it was taken over by the Japanese. And the same ship became your flagship in 65 and 71 war. So the turns and tides of history are very fascinating in both these two ships. And I think that's one of the many interesting aspects of these ships.
So in a way, the Delhi and later the Mysore brought us to the big boys table.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about her, what she did to operations, right? What she did to the Indian Navy's operational caliber. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. I mean, they added so much to your combat capability, but they were not simply about show and display. Though we must remember that show and display has an important aspect of deterrence in it.
And we will talk about that.
Yes. But they were involved in operations and war and combat missions. The first one that the Indian Navy was involved in a big way was Op Vijay in 1961. And in 1961, Mysore was the flagship. She was involved in the action of Anjadeep. She flew the flag of Admiral Soman, then the Fosif, and the liberation of Anjadeep Island. And
Captain Krishnan was brought back as the CEO.
That is for Delhi.
Delhi.
That's for Delhi. So Mysore was of Anjadeep. And Mysore did both command and control and coordination for operations in Anjadeep and Goa, the Fosif moving, and specifically, when they came under giving the supporting gunfire along with Trishul. Admiral Krishnan, later Captain Krishnan, was called back from being CEO of Shivaji. Delhi was got out of refit in haste, and she was supposed to be in refit for months. She got ready in a week or 10 days, and she was sent to Diu. And Diu, interestingly, she was told to stay 10 miles away, clear. And Krishnan being Krishnan, the first time the army reported some resistance, he said, like hell, I will do it. Went close to 1 mile, bombarded, and within 15 minutes of hitting the Diu fort, the flag of surrender went up. So both Delhi and Mysore were involved in the 61. 65, Mysore was the flagship of the Indian fleet. The Indian fleet had limited action at that time due to various political compulsions, but she was the flagship and she did what she had to do in terms of meeting the objectives then. And then 71, Delhi took part in a limited way. She was getting old by then, but Mysore was the flagship of the Western Fleet, with Admiral Chandy Kuruvilla flying his flag there, and Rusi Gandhi as the flag captain. So I think they have done whatever operational requirements was there. And later, mid-70s, Delhi was actually involved in a combat-like situation in the salvage of INS Godavari,
Right.
which had got grounded off Malay. It was
Right.
called the Godsal, Godavari salvage, in which I think Admiral Nadkarni was the CEO Delhi, or he was the senior officer supervising the operation, one of the two
Right.
things. But so they were useful in several ways until the
Right.
last way.
Right.
And I think they played a very, very important role in operations.
Hmm.
Certainly, I mean, there were other ships, including the aircraft carrier,
Sure.
but you can't take away the role of these two ships.
Right. Right. Right.
Mm.
Initially, I think, at least in the early days of after independence, Delhi and later the Mysore used to go on what was called the flag showing, cruises, they were called. So they did a lot for defense diplomacy as well, and diplomacy in general. So let's talk about that.
Yes, yes. In fact, though we use the word maritime diplomacy or defense diplomacy more now, in those days, as you said, it was flag showing or what was called cruises. Now we call overseas deployments.
Right.
But essentially, the fundamentals are the same. The use of warship, in showing flags is an essential component of the diplomatic role of navies.
That's right.
Now, what happens? One of course is that you're showcasing your navy. And I think Delhi and Mysore were brilliant because they were big, they had long legs. More importantly, they showcase latest technology. And even though they were British, the fact that Indians were now running these ships and managing them was important. But there's a bigger issue here, Swaroop. I think not many people give credit to the fact that Delhi and Mysore virtually mapped most parts of what we call the third world. They visited those days. They visited ports in Africa, in Asia. Mysore was the first one to go to China and Japan, and then to Russia. So the entire post-colonial landscape was being sort of mapped by these ships, and they were showing the Indian flag at this day. So they were in many ways, as I keep saying, a palpable physical manifestation of India in those parts of the world. They gave brand equity or brand recognition to India much before this term came into vogue. And being big ships, they also inspired a sense of awe. They also, in several parts of Africa and Asia, connected your diaspora. People who had gone hundreds of years ago now could see a part of territory that was India, sit on a deck which had the Indian flag, and get tremendous waves of nostalgia and a feeling of oneness with their mother country. So I think these ships played a huge part. I mean, there were certain more definitive aspects in terms of visits of heads of states. Almost everyone, Chow En Lai, for example, visited, Marshal Tito visited, and our own leaders. Pandit Ji went to Indonesia on the INS Delhi, for example. Babu Rajendra Prasad went on the Delhi to Andaman's first visit by a president. So these ships were visited by heads of states, by chief executives, both Indian, by important personages, and that gave them huge value.
I remember this, anecdote that I think Admiral Karmarkar had relayed when he was commanding Delhi, and she was on a visit to Kenya, and I mean, a place you were our defense advisor. And Jomo Kenyatta, thanked Captain Karmarkar, saying, "The last time I was on board a British warship, I was a part of the chipping party." And I think that sentence kind of term, sums up, the post-colonial, world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And remember, Jomo Kenyatta and Tom Mboya was there. They were taken by our ambassador, the great Appasaheb Pan. Now remember, this was a British, the ship was commanded by Karmarkar, but the flotilla was still commanded by a British officer.
That's right.
We were ourselves tethered to the British in many ways, just 3 or 4 years after independence. 51. Most importantly, Kenya was not independent. She was still, she became independent in 63. She was still a British colony. So to do this was an amazing act of bravery, chutzpah, gutsy foreign policy decision. The same thing in which we are doing in many ways now. And therefore, Jomo Kenyatta's statement has a great deal of poignancy to it. That last I was there as a chipping party, now I've been hosted in the captain's cabin. He was a guest in the captain's cabin, given a guard of honor,
Right.
received at the Mombasa airport by a white sergeant.
Right.
So all of that made a huge difference. So I think we haven't, I have done a couple of talks in Mumbai University on this issue. We have not emphasized enough about how these two ships mapped the post-colonial discourse, so to say.
So later in their life, both of them were were converted into a training role. So let's unpack what they did for training in the Indian Navy.
Yes, absolutely, and I can't do any better than quote Admiral Awati, the great man,
Right.
Who said, "If Delhi was the cradle,
Right.
Mysore was the kindergarten," and together these two ships form the nursery of Indian Navy's training.
Right.
And when you have a big ship like a cruiser converted into a training ship,
Right.
you are straight away training your cadets again to think big. So whether it's seamanship, boat activities, bridge activities, you are sort of making your young officers think in terms of big ships,
Right.
big anchor, big equipment, big guns.
Yeah.
So everything you're thinking of king size, so to say. And that's important.
Right.
Because if you want to have ambitions of being a big navy, a blue water navy, you got to train your people accordingly. But also more than that, I think there was a kind of sentimental association. The Delhi was converted. In fact, Delhi started to do, I think, training role from the mid 60s onwards.
Right.
And then the Mysore later. In fact, Mysore was decommissioned in 85.
Right.
But she was alongside when we came on a trip May 85 from NDA to sea, and you could see the kind of nostalgia and sort of veneration that people had for Mysore, these decks. So when you have a ship like this, iconic ships like this as training ships, not only do they teach you, you have big spaces which act as gun rooms where midshipmen or cadets can come together. There's camaraderie, there's bonding. But also you leave memories of a lifetime. That is why virtually anyone who's been anyone in the Navy has either trained on the Delhi or Mysore or passed through its gates. Particularly the early Navy. I think there might have been a rare exception who didn't do time on these two ships. And what they learned on these two, earning their sea legs, so to say, that couldn't be replicated anywhere. So I think they were great, while we are talking about the new Mysore and Delhi later separately, I think a lot of affection for the new avatars is because the old ones had such a lot of goodwill and nostalgia for them. So I think they were not just training ships, but they were the sort, like we all remember our schools and have those alumni get-togethers. There was something special about them.
And virtually, all flag officers, chiefs, have been, have either commanded or served on the Delhi and the Mysore. When she was commissioned, then Commander Katari was the commander, was the executive officer of the ship. Admiral Nanda was the first lieutenant. He later was the commissioning CEO of Mysore. So and pretty much every chief, right? It reads like a who's who.
Absolutely. Beginning with RDK, RD Katari, the first XO, the first Navy chief, the first fleet commander, the first Navy chief, Charles Nanda later.
All of them later flew their flag on one of these as the flagship.
Karmarkar as a flag officer. Chatterjee, the first Indian CO, became chief of naval staff later. So you had a catalogue of all the high and mighty in the Navy passed through the portals of these two ships, and they were great characters. Ronnie Pereira, Manohar Avati, Chakravarti, Rusi Gandhi. So all of them, Karmarkar, Chippy Sampson, Admiral Soman. So all of them were in one way the builders, but they were also characters in their own way. Some were eccentric, some were exotic, some were the larger than life, some were flamboyant.
Right.
But I think all of them earned their spurs
Right.
on these two ships,
Hmm.
and they sort of brought their leadership skills and savvy
Right.
to their own command tenures
Sure.
when they exercised that.
Right. Right.
Mm.
So, of course, the Delhi and Mysore are both named after landlocked entities, right? Landlocked states. You know, what was the kind of X factor that the Delhi and the Mysore kind of had, which makes them really venerable in a way?
Oh yes, lots. Yes, you're right. Landlocked in a sense, remember that Delhi was the capital,
Sure.
and INS Delhi was the first capital ship. So it made sense.
Got it.
Capital ship, big ship, flagship.
Yeah.
It made sense to name her as Delhi.
Yeah.
And Mysore, at the time she was named, was also the state, not just the city.
Right.
She was a state, and that state had a coastline. So you can't you can't call it landlocked in that sense.
Right.
But yes, I mean the point. But more importantly, like you said, several X factors.
Right.
What made them? First is there was huge amount of legends and stories. Like for example, they were well known throughout Asia. They were the largest in this part of the world. So they were called.
No Asian navy had a
for a long time.
Right.
So they were called the Queen of the Orient, Empress of the Indian Ocean, stories like that. They would take part in international exercises, jet. They were Indian flagships. Then also, like we talked, they etched this foreign cooperation landscape.
Right.
There were also superstitions, like you had this legend of the red bearded ghost on the Delhi.
Oh wow.
Which was a stoker, a sailor, a supposed Englishman who would come to the rescue of the ship when it seemed to do something wrong.
Lovely.
So there were several moments, and they've been recorded in the decommissioning brochures of these two ships. Then the mighty Mysore. I think the way they went all over, you see, even late 60s, Delhi did a 30,000 trip to Australia and New Zealand and Fiji under Wek Barbosa, Bambi Barbosa.
That's right.
The mid 60s, Mysore went to West Africa and Eastern Europe. I think they did about 20,000 miles. So it was in their reach and their power that they several sort of let's say colorful personalities dominated. So all in all, that led to some kind of larger than life personalities.
Right.
And let's not forget that there was fierce rivalry and competition between these two ships.
Definitely.
So whether it was regatta, whether it's an ordinary fleet exercise, and that itself added to keeping the fleet sort of cutting edge. You want that. You want that healthy competition. And so Delhi and Mysore had huge competition amongst themselves, which in turn added to the sense of both competition and collaboration in the fleet.
Right.
And of course, like we said, legends, whether Mysore or Delhi.
Right.
And then remember their power, 6-inch guns. Nobody had seen 6-inch guns. Action Information Organization, preliminary, but it was there. NBCD, communication was different. So in every which way, I mean, the amount of power they radiated and bristled, their very handsome, winsome looks, in the amount of people they could take. So they inspired awe.
Right.
I've said this before, I think, but
you have a personal relationship with the Delhi, of course, in a newer avatar. You commissioned her as part of the commissioning crew. You have any stories for us, Commodore?
I will keep the stories of the new Delhi,
right,
because we have to do a separate one on the new ones. I think it would be unfair to use that here. But what I can tell you is that as commissioning crew of Delhi and someone associated with bringing out the books, commissioning brochure, then the book on Mysore and Mumbai, I got to see and meet a lot of people who are associated with the old Delhi and old Mysore. And that was a great journey in itself. To see the love they had, to see the kind of connection they had. I learned a lot of my history of the Indian Navy through the eyes and anecdotes of those legendary people.
Right.
So, and to see the kind of love they had for that ship. I think that was an important turning point for me when I was the commissioning crew of Delhi. So I got to sort of witness that firsthand.
Right.
And what that meant, and how that transpired, and how that eventually helped make my journey into being a history lover of Indian Navy.
Right.
We will discuss in the subsequent episodes.
On that note, we come to the end of this episode. We are going to talk about the new Delhi, the new Mysore. A lot of episodes, lots to talk about. But let us know in the comments what else you'd like us to talk about. Thanks so much for joining us.